In the summer of 1970, a quiet logging road near Cedar Ridge, Washington, lay swallowed beneath towering pine and fir trees. The road bent like a scar through endless wilderness, traveled mostly by timber trucks and the occasional hunter. The Winslow family lived nearby in a sturdy wood cabin built by hand. George Winslow, his wife Margaret, and their 4-year-old son Henry lived a life of deep simplicity, raising chickens, growing vegetables, and bartering at the nearest town 15 miles away. They loved solitude and rarely received visitors. One cold September evening, as George returned from checking his snares, his lantern caught a dark, enormous shape lying near a ravine. At first he froze, thinking it might be a bear injured by a trap. But something didn't match a bear's form. The limbs were long, almost human. Dense reddish-brown fur covered its powerful frame, but the chest rose and fell gently. The creature was breathing, slowly and painfully. George took a tentative step closer. His heart hammered. The creature's face was half hidden beneath large arms, but when George leaned in, he saw a wide brow, deep-closed eyes, and lips that looked too expressive to be an animal's. Not a bear. Not any known species he'd ever encountered. He whispered into the forest air, "Dear God, is this what people have been talking about?" For generations, locals whispered of mountain shadows and howls at night. No one had proof, and most dismissed the tales as campfire fantasies. But George had never doubted that the wilderness could still hide ancient mysteries. Suddenly, a soft rustling made him spin around. A second shape crouched among the undergrowth, not lying, but watching. Its eyes, large and amber, glowed under the lantern light. It held a massive injured arm close to its chest, as if bracing itself. 2 of them. George backed away slowly, his instincts screaming at him to run. Yet the creatures didn't advance. The one on the ground let out a low, painful grunt, almost like a human moan. The standing one made a worried, chuffing sound, protective and emotional. George whispered, "You're a pair, maybe mates." He stood frozen, lantern trembling in his hand. Every childhood story about monsters tried to erupt through his imagination, but fear slowly gave way to awe. They weren't attacking him. They were suffering. He made a choice in that moment, not from logic, but from an unexplainable pull toward compassion. "I can't leave you here," he murmured. When he reached the cabin, Margaret saw the tremor in his voice. "Did something happen?" "You won't believe it," he said. "There are 2 large beings in the ravine. Hurt. Not animals. Not bears. Not apes. Something else." He searched for words and settled on, "They're real. Bigfoot. Sasquatch." Margaret stared blankly. "George, have you been—" "I'm not joking. I need blankets, water, and tools. They're alive." Her shock softened into curiosity. She trusted her husband's instincts. Within minutes, they returned with supplies. Approaching the ravine again, Margaret gasped when she saw them, not because of fear, but because the creatures' faces bore unmistakable emotion. The one lying down trembled with pain. The other knelt beside it, stroking its fur gently, as if comforting a wounded lover. Margaret whispered, "Oh, they feel—" The pair remained defensive but didn't lash out. George and Margaret placed water and scraps of bread a safe distance away. The standing creature studied them, sniffed the jar, then nudged water toward the injured one. When the injured creature drank, Margaret whispered, "They're intelligent." George nodded. "More than people think." That night, the family did not sleep. A storm broke over the valley, turning the ravine into a cold wash of rain. Margaret paced the cabin. "They'll freeze." At midnight, they brought coats and fresh blankets. The creatures allowed them closer, warily but without anger. As lightning struck, Margaret suddenly felt like she was protecting people, not wild beasts. George muttered, "If hunters or rangers find them, they'll be shot, captured, or put on display. Nobody would respect them." Margaret nodded. A powerful realization spread through her. Whatever these beings were, they deserved dignity. Over the next days, George quietly treated their wounds with herbal salves and makeshift bandages. He avoided making eye contact, careful not to threaten them. Henry, peeking through the window, felt no fear. To him, The enormous beings were simply quiet neighbors in need of help. By the end of the first week, the injured Sasquatch stood again. When George arrived with food, the creature reached out and faintly brushed George's shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement. Margaret witnessed it and whispered, "They trust you." The decision became irreversible. "We can't tell anyone," George said. Margaret whispered, "For how long?" "As long as it takes." For the first few years, the Winslows lived with a secret bigger than anything they could explain. The Sasquatch pair recovered their strength and gradually moved into a deep forest hollow near the cabin. George built a hidden feeding shelter using deadfall and natural camouflage, stocked with vegetables, berries, and occasionally venison. The creatures accepted the offerings without raiding livestock or frightening the family. As Henry grew older, he learned to keep his mouth sealed. "They're friends," he whispered to his younger sister Lily when she was old enough to understand. "They belong to the woods." At first, Margaret lived in mild terror that strangers would wander too close. But as years passed, she watched something extraordinary bloom. The Sasquatches weren't lurking with menace. They existed peacefully, almost spiritually. The male often brought small gifts, polished river stones, feathers, hand-peeled bark arranged like symbols. They seemed like tokens of gratitude. The female sometimes approached the orchard and observed Margaret gardening with quiet fascination. Her huge eyes shimmered with curiosity, and Margaret couldn't deny a maternal softness in them. The Winslows treated the creatures with reverence. No photographs, no written records, no evidence. They understood that the moment the outside world learned of them, everything would unravel. By the 1980s, local hunters began whispering about strange whoops echoing through the trees at dusk. A few complained about snapped branches or silhouettes dashing through moonlit passes, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. Cedar Ridge was wilderness. Unusual sounds were common. Through the seasons, George felt a deep, solemn duty. The Sasquatches were part of the land, like wolves and owls, but far more aware. He believed that centuries ago, old tribes might have lived beside them without fear. One winter, a terrible blizzard struck the valley. Snow piled so high that George could barely open the cabin door. The forest grew silent, except for the roaring wind. The Winslows worried for the Sasquatch pair, unsure whether their shelter would withstand the storm. Late at night, the cabin door trembled under heavy thuds. George grabbed a rifle, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. Margaret whispered, "They're cold." He opened the door slowly. The female Sasquatch stood there, snow blanketing her fur, holding a small shape wrapped in arms. Behind her, the male watched anxiously. She stepped into the cabin, not aggressive, but exhausted. When she opened her arms slightly, both George and Margaret froze. A newborn, the family gasped. The baby Sasquatch's tiny hand reached out, surprisingly delicate, eyes still shut. Margaret nearly cried at the sight. A living infant, fragile and shivering. George motioned toward the hearth. "Bring them in. They'll freeze." He opened space near the fire and moved the furniture aside. The cabin felt transformed, no longer just a home for humans, but a sanctuary for a hidden species. The female lay beside the fire, placing the baby gently on her chest. The male sat against the wall like a sentinel, watching the family with fierce protectiveness. Henry whispered, "We're caretakers." Lily nodded solemnly. The storm lasted 3 days. The Winslows rationed food, keeping the cabin warm and quiet. The creatures barely moved except to comfort the newborn. Margaret helped gather warm cloth scraps and fresh water. When the storm finally cleared, the Sasquatch family returned to the forest. But from that moment, the Winslows understood that their role was not just secrecy. It was preservation. In the years that followed, the infant grew into a strong young creature, following its parents through the forest. The Winslows never interfered too closely. They weren't captors, owners, or trainers. They were simply trusted neighbors. A bond formed that could never be spoken, only lived. Decades passed. Children grew, married, moved to distant cities, yet carried the secret like a sacred inheritance. George and Margaret aged but stayed on the land, caring quietly until their hair turned silver and faces wrinkled. In all those years, the Sasquatches never harmed a person, never revealed themselves, and never wandered near town. It was a perfect secret, protected by love, mutual respect, and silence, until the modern world changed everything. By the early 2000s, Cedar Ridge was no longer isolated. Hikers with smartphones, hunters with night vision equipment, and amateur cryptid enthusiasts swarmed the region after online forums spread rumors of giant footprints. Livestock disappeared from nearby farms, not taken by the Sasquatches, but by wandering cougars. Yet frightened ranchers blamed the unknown. George, now an old man with trembling hands, felt the pressure closing in. Margaret reminded him gently, "We kept them safe for 30 years. We must stay steady." But the forest felt watched again, not by Sasquatch eyes, but by human ones. Drone noises started buzzing overhead. Unknown vehicles appeared on fire roads. Game wardens questioned neighbors. Someone had filed strange wildlife reports. Then one spring afternoon, 2 strangers arrived claiming to be agents from a federal conservation department. They wore plain clothes, carried clipboards, and asked calm, calculated questions. "Have you heard unusual howls or seen large unclassified animals?" one asked. George smiled politely. "Plenty of owls and bears." The agent studied his face. "Any footprints larger than normal bears?" "Snow can stretch anything," George answered. "Have you noticed broken structures or food caches?" "Woodpeckers can make a mess," George told him. "So can teenagers." The agents left politely, but Margaret could feel the tension in George's shoulders. "They know," George whispered. "I don't think they know everything," Margaret said. "But they're circling." More strange incidents followed. Fresh excavation holes appeared where someone had dug for evidence. A private research drone hovered near the orchard. Flashlights flashed in the forest at 2 a.m. Henry returned from the city to help. "We need to warn them," he said. That night, Henry and Lily hiked deep toward the cavern where the Sasquatches rested. They produced soft whooping sounds that the creatures recognized. The Sasquatch pair appeared cautiously. Their offspring, now large and muscular, stood beside them. Henry whispered, "People are coming, dangerous ones." The male Sasquatch grumbled low, shaking the earth with vibration. The female held Henry's gaze with a haunting awareness, as if she understood every word. Henry continued, "You must stay deeper in the mountains. No paths, no edges near human trails." The creatures nodded, not literally, but with a gesture of comprehension. For months, the Sasquatch family vanished farther into the wilderness. The Winslows breathed easier, but the government investigation only intensified. More agents appeared, using infrared scanners and sediment tests. A neighbor told George, "They think there's an endangered large primate species here. They're sniffing around everything." Then the day came that changed everything. At dawn, a crack echoed through the valley. Rifle fire. Henry bolted toward the sound, terrified. A wounded deer? A hunter? Or something worse? Henry found agents tracking movement through the trees with scopes. The younger Sasquatch sprinted through the underbrush, panicked and disoriented. An agent shouted, "Don't let it escape. Tranquilize if necessary." Henry screamed, "Stop. They're not dangerous." But the creatures, sensing pursuit, crashed through the woods. No one attacked, but the fear was mutual and explosive. The younger Sasquatch tripped over a rocky ledge and fell hard. When it tried to stand, its leg buckled. The male Sasquatch roared, a sound that shook pine needles from branches. The agents froze, startled by the emotional anguish. Margaret appeared beside Henry, trembling. They're cornered, just like animals trapped for spectacle. The male Sasquatch lifted the injured young one and carried it toward a ravine. Agents surrounded from every direction. Guns up, not lethal bullets, but tranquilizer rounds. George arrived last, breathless, voice shaking with age and anger. "You will not harm them. They have lived peacefully longer than you've known their kind existed." One agent turned. "Sir, you've been hiding undocumented megafauna. This is a federal matter. These creatures must be taken for classification and containment." George shook with fury. "They are not laboratory animals." Henry shouted, "They are family. They mourn, they love, they protect just like we do." The forest went silent. Everyone, agents, Winslows, Sasquatches, stood suspended in a moment of pure truth. The male Sasquatch lowered its head near George. Not threatening, pleading. George whispered, voice breaking, "Please don't let them die in a cage." The agent in charge finally lowered his weapon. "Then tell us everything," he said quietly. From the beginning. Hours later, agents gathered inside the Winslow cabin. George and Margaret, with tears rolling silently, told the entire story. Every year, every storm, every newborn cry, every gesture of peace. The room was heavy with disbelief and reverence. The creatures, waiting outside the window line, watched with primal concern, uncertain of their fate. The head agent grew quiet. "This cannot go public. They will be hunted, photographed, dissected, monetized, militarized. If news breaks, every corporation and government worldwide will battle for ownership." Margaret felt hope. "So what happens now?" The agent stared at the fire. "We can't leave them here. Cedar Ridge is no longer safe. Modern people will find them eventually." George whispered, "Then what are you suggesting?" "A private protective reserve," the agent replied softly. "A forest ecosystem in Alaska, secured by federal classification as wildlife research land. No tourists, no public announcements, no exploitation, no public database. Only a handful of people will ever know." Henry felt his chest loosen. "They will survive?" "More than survive," the agent said. "They'll be free." The Winslows asked only one thing, that they be allowed a final goodbye. By dawn, the Sasquatch family stood near the cabin once more. The injured younger one leaned on its father, but seemed calmer. Margaret stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she placed a warm blanket over the young one, just as she had all those years ago when she welcomed his mother into the cabin during the blizzard. The female Sasquatch reached out gently and wrapped Margaret in a slow, careful embrace. Margaret pressed her head against the creature's chest and sobbed like a mother watching a child depart forever. George placed his hand on the male's massive arm. "You were never our secret. You were our responsibility, our neighbors, our friends." Henry added, voice shaking, "You made us better people." The agents quietly approached with trucks fitted for silent transport. No flashing lights, no media, no cages. Only soft bedding, water, and privacy. The Sasquatches hesitated, then stepped inside calmly, trusting the Winslows' sorrow more than any government official's promise. The trucks moved slowly into the forest, leaving no tracks. The Winslows watched until the last wheel vanished into fog and pine. The cabin felt impossibly empty. Weeks passed. Henry stayed to help George and Margaret navigate the silence of absence. The forest seemed quieter, like something sacred had left it. But the Winslows carried a deeper peace. The creatures weren't lost. They were safe. One December morning, a sealed letter arrived with no return address and a cryptic government seal. George tore it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a handwritten note from the lead agent. "They are healthy. The young one has healed. A new infant was born under the northern lights last month. All kept hidden and protected. Your choices preserve a lineage the world does not deserve to witness. Thank you for 43 years of guardianship." Attached was a small sketch, no photo, of a newborn Sasquatch sleeping in the arms of its parents under a blanket of snow and spruce. Margaret pressed the letter to her heart. "We didn't lose them." Henry whispered, "We saved a species." Outside, the wind drifted through cedar branches like a familiar goodbye. And though the forest no longer held gigantic shadows slipping between trees at dusk, the family felt them everywhere. In the rustle of leaves, in the memory of gentle eyes, in footprints erased by time. Cedar Ridge would never speak of the secret again. But somewhere far beyond human roads, under an unbroken sky, a family of giants walked unchained, alive because a small rural family chose compassion over fear, silence over fame, and love over possession. And that was the real miracle. The world never got to see them, but they got to stay wild. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.